I hadn't planned to step inside the gallery that evening. I was simply wandering, letting the city guide me, when the glow of soft light spilling from tall windows caught my attention. The sign outside was simple, handwritten, and almost shy about announcing itself. An evening with Elena Marin, paintings of silence. The name meant nothing to me then, but the moment I pushed the door open, a hush fell over me, as if I had walked into a sacred place. The air smelled faintly of linseed oil, varnish, and wood polish. Canvases leaned against the walls, tall and moody, the kind that seemed to breathe when you looked at them too long. And then I saw her. She was speaking softly with an older couple near the center of the room, her hands moving with quiet grace as she explained a piece. The first thing I noticed wasn't her words, but the way she carried herself, shoulders back, posture elegant, her presence filling the space without needing to demand it. Her dark hair was swept loosely into a knot, a few strands falling free to frame her face. There was strength in her, yes, but also a kind of distance, as though she had built a world inside herself and allowed only glimpses of it to slip out. I must have been staring too long, because suddenly her eyes met mine across the gallery. Hazel, warm, steady, and knowing. For a moment, I felt as if she had caught me trespassing in her private thoughts. Yet instead of looking away, she smiled. It wasn't the polite, distracted smile of someone accustomed to strangers. It was softer, tinged with curiosity, as though she were quietly asking me why I had come. I pretended to study a nearby painting, an abstract storm of blue and silver, but I could still feel her gaze on me, the way it lingered like a touch that refused to fade. When the couple moved on, she crossed the room toward me. Her steps were unhurried, deliberate, and I found myself holding my breath. "First time seeing my work?" she asked. Her voice was low and smooth, carrying the faintest trace of amusement, as though she already knew the answer. I nodded, forcing a small laugh. "It shows." She tilted her head, studying me not with arrogance, but with interest. "No, but your eyes give you away. They're searching, not analyzing. That's rare." And then, before I could find a reply, she extended her hand. Slim fingers, paint-stained near the cuticles, yet her touch was cool and steady when I took it. For a second, our hands lingered in that space between formality and something more, and I was acutely aware of how alive my own skin felt beneath hers. "Elena," she said simply. Her name fit her. Elegant, self-contained, yet carrying a weight of stories untold. In that moment, the gallery around us blurred into the background. The colors, the murmurs of other guests, even the city outside, all of it quieted. What remained was her hand in mine, her eyes searching my face, and the strange, certain knowledge that I was standing at the threshold of something I couldn't yet name. The crowd in the gallery eventually thinned, leaving behind only the muted shuffle of footsteps and a lingering murmur of art enthusiasts drifting toward the exit. I hadn't realized how long I'd been standing there, circling the same paintings, until Elena appeared at my side again. "You look like someone who needs a pause," she said softly. Her voice carried that same warmth as before, touched with a quiet amusement that made it impossible to refuse. I smiled sheepishly. I was trying to take it all in. Her lips curved, but her eyes betrayed something deeper, an almost shy flicker of gratitude. "Then maybe you should see it from a different angle." "Come." Before I could reply, she gestured toward the back of the studio, past the exhibit space, and into a smaller room lit by a single warm lamp. The air here was different, less curated, more personal. Half-finished canvases leaned against the wall, brushes crowded in jars, and a faint aroma of roasted beans mingled with the ever-present tang of paint. "Coffee," she offered, moving toward a small counter where an old-fashioned machine hissed softly. "Coffee sounds perfect," I said, settling onto a wooden stool. My eyes wandered. Over the splattered aprons hung on a hook, the sketchbooks stacked haphazardly, the small details that made this her space rather than just an exhibition. As she poured, I found myself watching her hands. The same hands that had painted storms and silences into canvas now cradled the mugs with surprising gentleness. When she set one in front of me, our fingers brushed. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a quiet current through me. "So," she said, sliding onto the stool across from mine, "tell me, what do you see in my paintings?" I hesitated, wary of sounding naive. But her gaze was steady, encouraging. They feel honest, like you're not trying to explain something, just showing it, letting people feel without needing words. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, her laughter came, soft, unguarded, carrying with it a note of relief. "That's the most sincere answer I've heard in years." I found myself grinning, emboldened. Maybe sincerity is easier when you don't know the rules. She tilted her head, studying me with those hazel eyes that seemed to peel back layers that I didn't know I had. "You're young," she said, not dismissively, but with a tone that acknowledged difference, experience, time. "And yet, there's something unfinished about you. A canvas waiting." Her words hung between us, light yet weighted, playful yet edged with something deeper. I felt heat rise in my chest, unsure if she realized how easily her metaphors struck closer than they should. Our conversation drifted after that, about places we'd traveled, books half-read, the way silence can feel heavy or comforting depending on who shares it. At some point, our knees brushed under the narrow table. Neither of us pulled away. The gallery outside was silent now, the night pressing against the windows. Here, in this tucked-away corner of her world, it felt as if time had slowed to a heartbeat, 2 mugs of coffee, and a pair of strangers leaning just slightly too close. And in that closeness, the first threads of something unspoken began to weave themselves between us. The days that followed our first meeting blurred together, though I remember each time I thought of her, her voice, her hands, the way her eyes seemed to weigh silence before giving words. I found myself walking past the gallery more often than I'd admit to anyone else, as if some part of me hoped she'd sense it and invite me in again. She did. On the 3rd evening, I stepped through the familiar door and found her alone this time. The exhibition was quieter, only a few visitors scattered through the room, and she stood near a half-finished piece that hadn't been there before. Her hair was looser tonight, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked up as if she had been expecting me. "You came back," she said, her smile small but genuine. "Couldn't stay away," I admitted, more honestly than I'd planned. Something flickered in her expression. Amusement, yes, but also a kind of softness that made my chest tighten. She beckoned me closer, leading me to the corner where her paints were set out, brushes resting in jars like soldiers at ease. "I was thinking," she began, turning one brush slowly in her hand, "you'd make an interesting subject." I laughed, caught off guard. "Me? I'm not sure what's interesting about me." Her gaze lifted, locking onto mine. It wasn't playful this time. It was steady, deliberate, the kind of look that made the air feel heavier between us. "You're a blank canvas," she said finally. "Unmarked, unafraid. I want to paint you." The words landed with more weight than she could have intended, and for a heartbeat I forgot how to breathe. Something in her tone, gentle yet charged, felt less like an artist's request and more like a confession she wasn't ready to put into plainer language. I tried to deflect, though my voice betrayed my nervousness. "You make it sound like I'm waiting to be written on." Her lips curved in a quiet smile. "Aren't we all? So people hide their stories. Others let themselves be seen." Her hand lifted slightly, as if she might touch my face, but she stopped midway, fingers curling back around the brush. Even that half movement left me aware of how close she was, of how easily the boundaries of art and desire blurred in her presence. "I don't know if I'd be any good at sitting still," I said softly. "That's the beauty," she replied. "I'm not painting stillness. I'm painting you." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The faint hum of the gallery lights filled the silence, and the smell of turpentine hung in the air like a third presence between us. Her eyes lingered on me, not as a stranger or a guest, but as something chosen. Finally, I nodded, my voice quiet. All right, paint me. Her smile deepened, not triumphant, not teasing, but almost relieved, as though, in asking, she had risked more than I knew. And in saying yes, I'd stepped into her world, not just as a visitor, but as something she could no longer ignore. The studio felt different when I returned. It was no longer just a gallery I'd wandered into. It was her space, her sanctuary. The world outside seemed to fade as I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. Evening light filtered through tall windows, painting the room in soft gold and shadow. Canvases leaned at every angle, jars of brushes scattered like small armies waiting for her command. She had already prepared a chair for me in the center, its plain wooden frame set beneath the wash of light. The moment I saw it, my chest tightened with a mixture of anticipation and unease. Elena glanced up from her easel, her expression calm, yet something in her eyes suggested she'd been waiting, perhaps even restless, for this moment. "You came," she said, almost as if she had doubted I would. I swallowed, trying to mask the edge of nerves in my voice. I said I would. Her smile was small, approving. "Seat." I lowered myself into the chair, acutely aware of how exposed I felt. There was nothing dramatic about it. I was simply sitting, but under her gaze, even the smallest shift of my shoulders seemed significant. She studied me silently, brush in hand, her eyes tracing lines across my face as though she were already painting me in her mind. At first, the sound of the brush against canvas was steady, rhythmic. I tried to relax, but every time I glanced up, her eyes were there, focused, unblinking, searching. It was a gaze that stripped away more than appearance. It made me feel seen in ways I hadn't prepared for. "Lift your chin a little," she murmured, stepping closer. Her hand hovered briefly before brushing under my jaw, adjusting me with the lightest touch. Her fingertips lingered just long enough to make my breath catch, and then they were gone, replaced by the rustle of fabric as she returned to the easel. I told myself to stay still, but my pulse was too loud in my ears. Every movement she made, the swish of her brush and paint, the soft exhale as she studied me, echoed in the quiet room. At one point, she paused, frowning slightly, not in displeasure, but in thought. She walked toward me again, her wrist smudged faintly with cobalt blue. This time, she brushed a lock of my hair back from my forehead, her touch slower, gentler. "Better," she whispered, though her tone carried something unspoken, as if the adjustment had little to do with composition and everything to do with closeness. I wanted to say something, anything, but words felt clumsy against the silence she had woven around us. So I stayed still, letting her look at me as though I were both subject and secret. When she returned to the canvas, her brush moved more slowly, almost hesitantly, as if distracted. I realized then that this portrait wasn't just about capturing likeness. It was about something deeper, something she saw in me that I hadn't yet dared to see in myself. And in that quiet, with only her breath and the brush between us, I understood this was no longer just art. This was intimacy in disque. It was during our second sitting that the silence became too heavy to ignore. The rain had begun in the late afternoon, and by the time I arrived, it tapped steadily against the wide windows of her studio, soft but insistent, like a metronome keeping time. The world outside blurred into gray, but inside, everything was vivid. Her paint spread out in restless patches of color, the lamplight spilling warmth across the floorboards, the faint hum of music barely audible from a corner speaker. I sat again in the wooden chair, and Elena worked with quiet determination. Her brush moved, but slower this time, less certain, as if each stroke carried hesitation. I watched her eyes as they traveled from canvas to me and back again. There was something weighed down in her expression, something I hadn't noticed before. When she finally set the brush aside, she exhaled heavily, pulling the stool closer to sit in front of me. For once, her gaze wasn't steady. It faltered, drifting to the floor before returning to my face. "Do you know why I paint?" she asked suddenly. I shook my head. "Because you're gifted. Because it's what you love." Her lips twitched into the barest smile, but it didn't last. "I paint because I can't say things out loud. It's easier to put them on canvas and let people assume whatever meaning they want. That way, the truth stays hidden but still alive." Her words hung between us, heavy and quiet. I searched her face, realizing she wasn't talking about art anymore. "What kind of truths?" I asked gently. Her hand lifted, absently rubbing at a streak of paint across her wrist. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer, but then she whispered, "Loneliness, longing, the fear that life will pass me by while I'm still waiting for something I can't name." Her vulnerability stunned me. This woman who had carried herself with such composure, who had seemed untouchable in her elegance, was now exposing the raw edges beneath. I leaned forward without thinking, my voice low. "You don't have to wait alone." She looked up sharply, her eyes searching mine as though she wanted to believe me, but didn't know how. And then, almost without realizing it, her hand reached across the space between us. Her fingertips touched my forearm, light at first, then firmer, resting there as if to ground herself. The warmth of her skin spread through me, a pulse that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat. I didn't move. I didn't want to break the fragile honesty of the moment. Her thumb traced a slow, absent circle against my sleeve, and though the gesture was small, it carried more intimacy than any embrace. "I shouldn't be telling you this," she murmured, but her hand didn't let go. "Maybe you needed to," I said softly. The rain tapped harder against the window, filling the silence that followed. And in that silence, something shifted, not in her painting, not in her posture, but in the space between us. It was no longer artist and subject. It was simply two people stripped of roles, meeting in their most human place, vulnerability. The portrait was nearly finished. I could see it forming on the canvas across from me, my likeness emerging through her brushstrokes, but altered, somehow more alive, more vulnerable than I felt in my own skin. It was uncanny, almost unsettling, as though Elena were painting not just the shape of me, but something I hadn't even admitted to myself. The studio was dim that evening, lit only by the tall lamp near her easel and the fading light seeping through rain-streaked windows. The world outside was hushed, leaving only the muted scrape of her brush and the rhythm of our breathing. She had been unusually quiet, even for her. Her brow furrowed in concentration, yet her gaze strayed from the canvas too often, landing on me in ways that lingered. Each time, I felt it like her eyes were hands, tracing me, shaping me, pulling something unspoken to the surface. At one point, she set the brush down and stepped closer. I thought she was about to adjust my posture again, the way she had in earlier sittings. But this time, her movements were slower, hesitant. "Hold still," she whispered. Her hand lifted, fingertips brushing against my temple as she smoothed a strand of hair back from my forehead. The touch was feather-light, yet my entire body reacted as if struck by a current. She didn't pull away immediately. Her palm lingered, cupping the side of my face for a heartbeat longer than necessary. I looked up at her, caught in that narrow space where breath and silence meet. Her eyes held mine, hazel flecked with gold, filled with something I couldn't quite name. Longing, maybe, or fear, or both woven together. The world seemed to shrink until there was only that touch. Her hand warm against my skin, my pulse thrumming beneath it. My chest tightened, caught between the urge to close the distance and the weight of everything unspoken between us. She let out a slow breath, her thumb brushing once, barely, against my cheekbone. "You don't realize," she murmured, almost to herself, "how much you changed the room just by being in it." I swallowed, my throat dry. "Maybe it's you who makes me feel like I belong here." For a long moment, we didn't move. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was charged, trembling, like the air before a storm. I could feel the question hanging there, unspoken but undeniable. Would we step past the boundary, or would we hold the tension where it lived, fragile and perfect? Her hand slipped away slowly, reluctantly, leaving behind the ghost of warmth on my skin. She turned back to her easel, but her movements lacked their earlier precision. The brush trembled faintly in her grip, and I sat there, heart pounding, knowing we had crossed into something neither of us could paint over. It wasn't a kiss, it wasn't a declaration, but in that silent touch, in the way her hand had lingered and her eyes had refused to look away, we had already said everything. The next time I returned, the rain had given way to a pale, cloud-streaked sky. The studio smelled richer than usual, the sharp tang of oils still fresh in the air. She'd covered the easel with a cloth, though I could see the faint outline of my portrait beneath. Elena stood nearby, arms folded loosely, as if guarding not just the canvas but the meaning behind it. "You finished it," I said softly. Her eyes flickered toward me, steady yet uncertain. "I think so. Or maybe it finished itself." There was a silence then, heavier than any we'd shared before. She looked almost nervous, an expression I hadn't thought possible for her. This woman who always carried herself with such quiet command. For the first time, she seemed vulnerable. "Can I see it?" I asked. She hesitated, then stepped forward and pulled the cloth away. I expected to see myself, a likeness captured with her precision. But what met my eyes was something else entirely. Yes, my features were there, but softened, alive with an intensity one hadn't known she'd seen. The colors around me were warm, sunlit tones, golds, and deep ambers, giving me a presence larger than life, as though I were not merely a subject but something significant. I stared, unable to find words. The painting didn't just reflect me. It reflected how she saw me. "Elena," my voice faltered. "This isn't just a portrait." She looked down, almost shy, and for a long moment she didn't answer. Finally, she whispered, "It's what I couldn't say aloud." The weight of those words pressed into me, as real as her hand had been on my cheek days before. My chest ached with the need to respond, but not with words. Words felt too small. Instead, I stepped closer. Her breath caught as I reached for her hand. Her fingers were cool at first, then softened against mine, curling as if they had been waiting. She didn't pull away. "You don't have to say it," I murmured. "It's here." I nodded toward the painting. "And here." I pressed her hand lightly to my chest. Her eyes glistened, hazel shimmering with a mix of relief and longing. And then, slowly, she closed the distance between us. Not with haste, not with hunger, but with a surrender that felt deeper than any declaration. Her arms slipped around my waist, her cheek resting against my chest. I held her there, feeling the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat, the way her body relaxed as though she had finally laid down a weight she'd carried too long. The portrait glowed in the background, silent and eternal, bearing witness to the moment neither of us had the courage to put into sentences. In that embrace, I understood. What had begun as paint and canvas had become something else entirely. She had painted me, yes, but more than that, she had let me in. And now, we belonged not just in her art, but in each other's lives.